I'll work to integrate into the group conversation once everyone's been introduced and made initial remarks. I'm excited to share that this is being recorded. This discussion is being recorded. And so if you go to our website for our agency over the next day, you'll have a recording of this discussion that you can share with others. Also included on that site will be a copy of all the information links on our chat. So we've learned that that's really helpful for those that want to follow up on things that we're talking about. So let's jump into our conversation. I want to first introduce my colleague, Megan Hurdle. Megan serves as our Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat. And in that role, Megan is focused on helping lead the way to cut green tape. So Megan, welcome. You are not in the beautiful coastal field. You're just down the hall in Sacramento here at our Natural Resources headquarters building. But thanks for all of your leadership on cutting the green tape. And we thought it'd be helpful initially just to explain and describe what we mean when we use this term, cutting green tape.
Great. Thanks so much, Secretary. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here and in my virtual field of flowers behind me. So you and I were just talking about bureaucracy and needing to get things done faster and more efficiently. And you said something that really resonated with me, and that's that when people think about government, they also think about red tape, right? It's slow, it's cumbersome. But what we're here to talk about today is green tape. And that's because for a long time, our environmental projects, our restoration of wetlands, of grasslands, our conservation work, it had to go through that same red tape that you would have to do for a development project. Well, several years ago, particularly ramping up when Governor Newsom issued the executive order for 30 by 30 in 2020 and also directed us to do environmental restoration faster, we came up with this concept of cutting the green tape. And like you said, the whole idea is how can we permit and streamline our own government processes that are needed to have restorations take place? How do we do that faster, more efficiently, more effectively? And we know this is incredibly important as we face climate change impacts, loss of biodiversity, and really the need to do work now to make sure we have resilient communities, plants, people, and animals going forward.
Yeah, and so that's really helpful. So it's all about helping good environmental things happen more quickly and cost effectively and ultimately effectively. Some folks, when they hear us talking about streamlining processes, get really worried that maybe this is a wolf in sheep's clothing, that somehow we're reducing environmental reviews on projects that would have negative environmental impacts. Can you distinguish what green tape, cutting green tape is not?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the common sayings I hear is that if you're doing a wetland restoration, you shouldn't have to get the same permits as a Walmart, right? Well, cutting the green tape means that we look at ways to expedite projects in the permit process that are doing that environmental benefit, that are doing that extra environmental uplift. Walmart still need to go through the regular permitting process. They would not be eligible for these types of reviews. The other thing I want people to know is in cutting the green tape, it doesn't mean that projects aren't getting looked at and reviewed by the experts. And you'll hear from some of those experts on this presentation today. They are still getting reviewed and considered, but what we're doing is recognizing that these are net benefit projects for the environment. And so we're looking at them a bit differently and thinking about how can we coordinate both within our entities and departments, but also across partners to move things more quickly.
That's exciting. And today we'll talk about just what progress we've made and the work ahead of us. So let's get underway and introduce panelists that are actually on the ground getting this work done. And I'm proud to bring onto the screen Kellex Nelson. Kellex is a colleague and she's become a friend over the last several years. She leads the San Mateo Resource Conservation District, the so-called RCDs. I talk about RCDs as the sort of Swiss Army knife of conservation. They do so many things across our state to advance our environmental goals. And so Kellex leads this effort in San Mateo County, but she is also a leader of this entity called the Landscape Stewardship Network. And I have to say, this cutting the green tape wasn't my idea. It wasn't our agency's idea. It really bubbled up from those folks like Kellex's organization that are on the ground doing the environmental restoration work. So Kellex, if you would, help us understand the arc of this movement. Why you and others really came to Sacramento to push this effort and what you've seen over the years as we've worked together.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for holding this conversation and for inviting me to this. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of an echo here. Let me, there we go. I apologize. Yeah, so for those who aren't super familiar with RCDs, we're a form of local government that exists throughout California. And we were created by the state in the 1930s as a key mechanism to deliver locally led, locally relevant conservation. Our job is basically to help people help the land. So we are working across public and private lands, scales large and small, all aspects of conserving and restoring natural resources. On any given day, we might be helping a farmer manage her irrigation system to benefit endangered coho salmon. Or we might be working with California state parks on wetlands restoration or restoring a redwood forest. Our work is incredibly diverse, but what we encountered often is that the regulations that are essential to protecting the environment had the unintended consequence of making it harder to do work that was environmentally beneficial. So I might need 7 to 9 local, state, and federal permits to restore habitat for critically endangered wildlife species. There could be high costs and delays, a lot of redundancies, and sometimes even conflicting requirements for different permits. And in a climate crisis and biodiversity crisis like we're in right now, this is something we simply can't afford. In fact, Secretary Crowfoot, as I've heard you say, on climate change, winning slowly is losing, and that we have to keep up with the rate of change and disruption. So we didn't want to lose any essential environmental protections, but we did need some new right fitting and efficient ways to permit these kinds of projects that have to happen now. This wasn't a new concept. There have been many talented people and organizations that have been advancing these solutions for decades. Groups like Sustainable Conservation or some agency staff who are here now from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the State Water Board. But then through the California Landscape Stewardship Network Collaborative, I had the opportunity to meet with you in 2019. And we charted a path forward for a cohesive interagency strategic initiative to bring stakeholders together, a few hundred stakeholders from around California, and to develop a set of recommendations for California and really drive them forward with some new and focused energy, in no small part thanks to your leadership. It's been very, very exciting. And since then, many of the set of recommendations in the report that we completed have been implemented. Some great new ideas are being developed that weren't even considered back then, that I feel like the line has been moved about what's possible. And now in my work on cutting green tape, I'm focused on helping to ensure that these investments that California has made are enduring into the future, and that we're supporting agency staff who are excited about this new approach to environmental protection, including training opportunities and interagency coordination. And I'm personally really excited about what the future holds with these very talented and motivated agency staff that I've been meeting, who are the boots on the ground for effectively permitting these projects.
Yeah, it's incredible to see the work that's happening across the state and how projects are actually getting put in place, whether it's stream restoration or wetland restoration, all this good environmental stuff happening more quickly and cost effectively. We're going to hear about that in a bit. I wanted to ask you what your background is.
My background is kind of diverse. I spent.
Oh, sorry. I mean, like literally your background on Zoom.
Oh, this is the very beautiful Pescadero Marsh State Natural Preserve. And this is a place that is the largest coastal estuary for a couple hundred miles, home to many threatened and endangered species, and the beneficiary of a number of regulatory efficiencies in its restoration.
That's awesome. So we're actually seeing the fruits of the labor of cutting the green tape.
We are.
Incredible. Excellent, Kellex. We're going to bring you back into the group conversation. Next, I'm going to bring up my friend and colleague, Chuck Bonham. Chuck leads the department that really leads our effort to protect and restore nature in California, our Department of Fish and Wildlife. And Chuck, you have been a leader in cutting the green tape. And, you know, the way I talk about the origin story is, on the one hand, you had Kellex and this movement of practitioners across the state that came to me in my role as secretary saying, hey, we need help. But actually, even before that, you and your colleagues at Fish and Wildlife were doing your own version of cutting the green tape. So talk about, why this is important to you, and even more importantly, what's been happening since you kicked this off.
Thanks, Wade, and welcome to the 420 plus growing people who are joining us. I hope you walk away an hour later inspired and enthused for cutting green tape. Bottom line up front, cutting green tape works, and we should do more of it. So if I could jump in my, Back to the Future car, I'd show up in 2017 and 18, and I was, director then at the end of Governor Brown's tenure, fourth term. And Kellex and a lot of the department's partners, we've been doing traditional grant making for decades to support restoration work along coastal streams. Came to the department and says, it's too hard to get grants and then get the work done. So we convened and we sat around the table for a while, 2017, 18. I came up with the catchphrase better, stronger, faster, which by the way, sucks compared to cutting the green tape. I mean, that is the moniker that really works and captures the spirit of this. So by the time, Governor Newsom starts and you become secretary, y'all ask me to stick around. I think our minds had this harmonic convergence. We need to do more faster. And with partners like Kellex and tribal restoration leaders, we start cutting the green tape. And I've got this other dynamic at play, which is in an even earlier moment in my life at an organization called Trout Unlimited. Part of my job way back then, like 15 years ago, was actually getting permits from the Department of Fish and Wildlife to do restoration and state grants to do restoration work. So I'd had my own journey on how hard that can be sometimes. And the successes speak for themselves. So everyone buckle up for a moment. Kellex, the secretary, start this effort across agencies. We get it going. Our department internalizes it, institutionalizes it. We actually ask for staff and volunteers, momentarily pausing to shout out Brad Henderson, who's awesome at this for the department. And we separated staff and we did a pilot project in the year of 2020. And then the following year, the legislature saw the wisdom, gave us dedicated positions, permanent funding. We are today celebrating the 3-year anniversary of our Cutting the Green Tape program. And I'm going to run through some statistics, but boy, it matters for people. This is good for people. So don't get lost in the statistics. You do more restoration work, you got healthier rivers. If you like to recreate on a river, if you make a living in a river, if you're a tribal sovereign who really knows no past, present, or future without a river as the center of their universe, you can do restoration and make more wetlands. If you're into clean water for drinking, wetlands help you get that. If you're a kid, if you're a parent and you talk to your kid, watch their face light up when you talk about bees or beavers or butterflies. You do restoration, you can get more of those. You do restoration these days, we actually seek advice of our tribal leaders, our Indigenous people who know how to do restoration from the beginning of the time. So we're forging relationships across sovereigns, and it's jobs. If you think primarily about the North Coast of California and its transition over the years from consumptive industries to different, restoration is job making in our coastal communities. It saves time and money. So here's how it saves time and money. Our program at our department right now has 2 dedicated restoration pathways, and we have a powerful California Environmental Quality Act statutory exemption. Some people hear exemption in CEQA and they freak out. Let me tell the 434 people, for years, California has done a CEQA exemption for a stadium or some other large project. Back in 2021, the legislature took a chance on our department, governor's leadership, your leadership. We now have a CEQA exemption subject to very stringent criteria that if someone's doing a restoration project, they don't have to do all that review. They can go straight to doing the restoration. Back in 2021, A lot of the environmental organizations, conservation groups, I think we're cynical, we're skeptical. Just this summer in 2024, the legislature and the governor renewed that authority for another time frame, and a vast number of environmental conservation groups, including ones who opposed it originally, signed up to support it. So since the start of this program for 3 years, our department has funded, permitted, assisted with the review, or done these CEQA exemptions for 570 projects.
Wow.
We have enhanced 192,018 acres. 5,518,000 acres of terrestrial habitats have been reconnected. 626 stream miles have been enhanced, saving for everyone involved in that work an estimated $9,505,343. We have it down to the penny, with an averaging processing time of 48 days for each of those individual 570 projects. And to come full circle quickly, back to the granting idea, we've been able in the last couple of years for our department to sync that streamlining of permitting with our granting function, which is how we started this as our problem solve back 8 years ago. So we've taken in since 2022 over $200 million in new grant funding to then move out for drought, climate, nature-based solutions. Over that time frame, we launched a new single application available on an ongoing basis. People can come in rolling on the solicitation, get one simple application for us. It's shorter, and we've synced that with the cutting the green tape permitting abilities, and we moved $198 million over the 2 fiscal years to 106 of those 570 projects. And now, as Calix mentioned, we're on the brink of something even more exciting. We just had legislation, the legislature advanced, the governor signed. January 1 of next year, Wade is so overwhelmed, he had to step out.
But you and I have the same situation, which is our automatic
Our
lights
lights,
turned off.
yeah. January 1 of next year, a short like 30 days away, our department is going to combine all 5 of the most common department authorizations: California Endangered Species Act, fully protected common species, rare plants, and lake and stream bed alteration agreements into one single streamlined approval permit for any restoration project. That's where we're
amazing.
at, 3 years after cutting the green tape started.
That's incredible. Yeah, give a wave to, we're at the Natural Resources Agency headquarters, very energy efficient building, but the lights turn off every 15 minutes if you don't move. I'm so excited, one, by those numbers. Holy smokes, it's incredible that you're tracking those numbers at that level of detail, but also the scale of the impact. But I also appreciated that you articulated why we should care about this. Yes, it's important for fish and wildlife, but it's also critically important for Californians. And people are actually experiencing benefits from your ability to move further and faster. And so incredible that you're turning on that consolidation of permits, 5 permits into one. That legislation, that legislative directive just passed, I think, this fall. So you're already putting in place. Super impressive. Big thanks to not only your cutting green tape unit within the department, but leaders across your regions that are driving this forward. I want to bring on, after Chuck, Phil Crater, who is doing incredible work with one of our key sister agencies, which is the California State Water Resources Control Board, or what we all know as the Water Board for short. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is an important agency that protects the environment, and so is the Water Board. And so the Water Board protects the environment under a separate set of legal requirements. And so, Phil, you and your leader, Joaquin Escobar, who's chair of the board, have really driven this forward at the Water Board as well. So talk about what you've been doing and what you are doing to cut the green tape over your way.
Hey, thank you, and good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, thanks. I want to first of all just thank Secretary Crowfoot and Deputy Secretary Herzl for the introduction today and all the fellow panelists for their support in this effort. Chair Esquivel sends his regards today. We have a board meeting and he couldn't be here. But I'm very excited to be here. And I am enthused by the statistics that I just heard from Director Bonham. Those numbers are fantastic. I was looking at numbers and I lost count after 30, 40, 50 approvals that we've made for restoration projects in recent times, and we've reduced our approval times. And rather than talking about the specific projects today, what I wanted to focus on are kind of some concepts that we're hammering to move forward on this. And so the way I'm thinking about work that we've been doing is in terms of teams, tools, and training, which is easy for me to remember. The 3 T's. But in terms of teams, we've really got a strong focus on culture and mindset. We're a core regulatory agency, and we've been trained to write permits and regulate discharges to protect water quality. And there's a tension between that mission of protecting and then trying to change your mindset to issuing these permits quickly. But we do want to differentiate between the classic sort of strip mall kind of development versus good restoration projects and make sure that we're being judicious with our resources. And so our board made it clear to us that this is an important effort and we want to support it. To do so, we encourage staff right now. We're really encouraging our teams to be bold and to advance novel ideas. And part of working with staff to do that is just really thinking generally, like if a project is going to lift the habitat function, it's a good project. Let's figure out how to do it. We are developing a suite of tools to help us get there. But we want staff to think about new ways to do things. And part of that also means that, they may make mistakes. If they're not making any mistakes, it's probably because they're not making any decisions. If we make decisions, we might make mistakes. We want to reinforce creativity and enthusiasm. So we're trying to give a little bit of leeway to come up with approaches. In terms of tools, we are working on developing permits and policies that are going to expedite the review and approval for restoration activities. That's how we're thinking about streamlining, is rather than just saying streamlining, we'd like Deputy Secretary Hertel said, we want to streamline or expedite the review and approval process. And so we know that CEQA and NEPA are difficult and they can pose challenges in terms of cost and time. We're trying to front load that. You just heard from Director Bonham about some great front loading that's going on at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We're also front loading our own environmental review, and where we don't have the same tools in terms of exemptions, we can develop general permits as opposed to individual permits. And the general permits that we develop at the Water Board allow practitioners to enroll in a permit that already exists, and we front loaded the environmental review in that. And that's the approach that we're using because it's kind of the 80-20 principle. And what we want to do is tackle as many projects as we can with our general permits where the requirements are known up front, and leave the harder, more challenging projects for individual permits so we can spend that time working on those projects. They're still a priority. They just might not fit into our easy buttons, but we want to get as many there. So it's like this mindset is start with yes. And if we can't start with yes, we want our staff to get to yes and do what they need to do. The last component of this is training. And we know that we're developing all these tools, but if people don't know how to use them, they're not doing us any good. So we're training our water board staff. We have a lot of internal training going on. It's a real focus. We're also sharing what we're learning with other agency staff. And in particular, we've been working closely with Department of Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Commission, and others who have permitting roles. And we're also working with practitioners. Ultimately, the restoration community's experience is what matters here. We're not developing the projects. We're just saying yes or no, right? We need to make sure that the people who are trying to advance the projects are finding a successful and a streamlined route. There are a couple of projects I want to name really quickly that we're specifically proud of. One is our ongoing work on the small habitat restoration general order that's been around for years, but it had size limitations. So it's really useful for smaller projects, but there was a gap. And following on that gap, we developed the large habitat restoration general order. We worked very closely with Department of Fish and Wildlife, Sustainable Conservation, Landscape Stewardship Network, and others to develop that order. It provides broad coverage in a very simplified process. It's got a menu of conditions that you can select from, and it basically allows people to design projects where the conditions are already included. So those are a few tools that we've developed. We're really excited about them. We're rolling them out. We're in an implementation phase. But we're not just working with water boards staff, we're also working with our partner agencies, and a big one that we're working on is Department of Fish and Wildlife on coordinating. And that's because we can develop all these tools, but if one agency is moving faster than another, it's the slower agency that's ultimately the long haul for applicants. And so we're working on a joint expedited review and approval process. And we are, and I'm seeing a note here that I should be careful to refer to our coordination with state Fish and Wildlife versus federal Fish and Wildlife. Apologies if I'm speaking in shorthand there. But we're trying to expedite the review and approval process of ours, and we know that our other agencies need to be able to keep up. And so we want to make sure everybody's familiar with what we're doing. We can't work in a vacuum. We have done a lot of coordination on the permit development so far, including the habitat restoration permits and our vegetation general order. And this not only develops the tool, but what we're finding is really important is that it makes the connections with the other agencies. We've got more eyes and ears out in the field. If applicants need help, we're here for them to help. And we're encouraging and holding each other accountable to that mindset change that we're talking about. We are also now working on guidance for staff and practitioners that clarifies process integration between our permits and others. And so shortly, we're going to have some guidance coming out for how to make the best choice when we've got multiple tools between water boards and Fish and Wildlife, so you can get the best alignment and the most bang for your buck on investment. So I'm going to kind of pause there. I know I'm talking about a lot, but I just wanted to just make sure you know we're invested, and the best advice I can give to people to operationalize this, whether you're agency staff or a practitioner, if you have questions, pick up the phone. We want to consult early, we want to consult often, and we want to make sure that we're providing service. These are important activities, and we want to get them done. So I'll pause there, and if there's questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Phil, incredible work. And I want to ask you one question before you go. But I just want to acknowledge, what you've done at the water board with these programmatic permits. So enabling entities with a certain program or a certain restoration type to actually plug into an environmental process that's been developed, and this expansion of this small habitat expedited process to larger habitat. I hear all the time that those have been game changers to actually getting these projects done more quickly. So huge thanks. And I love the fact that you're continuing to figure out how to improve the process even better and to coordinate. It sounds terribly complex, all of the different requirements that you have to abide, as well as our state Fish and Wildlife, not to mention our federal partners. But you're really trying to figure out how you coordinate to reduce the complexity for those on the ground getting the work done. Question I wanted to ask you is training. You talked about teams, tools, and training. And I know people like you and Chuck, you've been living this for the last few years, but I imagine you have staff, in your sort of decentralized regional water boards, as well as in Chuck's sort of regions throughout the state that might not be as familiar with how to apply these or when to apply them. What are you doing around training so that these tools can be used across the state?
Thanks for acknowledging that challenge. That's something that we've invested a lot of time into. So we have roundtables that we've operationalized at the regional and state boards over the years, and our roundtables meet regularly and every couple of months to get together and discuss the challenges that come up. At the roundtables, we're rolling out guidance, and then the roundtables are working actually with subcommittees with Department of Fish and Wildlife staff at those regions to make sure that we're all sharing the information. One thing that we found it's really important to be mindful of is turnover. We develop these great working relationships and an understanding, and if we stop talking about it, the erosion of that talent and that skill set immediately starts. And so this needs to be, we need to live it and breathe it every day, make sure that our teams stay current, and make sure that we're encouraging and supporting that kind of engagement with other agencies and practitioners as well. So that's it's most of the work is in that now.
Yeah, it's really encouraging. So huge thanks, and do thank Chair Escobar for his leadership driving this. I want to next bring on Don Hankins. Don is a professor at the California State University at Chico. He's also a leader of the Indigenous Stewardship Network. He's also a teacher, colleague, and a friend of mine. We work together on a whole lot of things. Don helps to lead a joint task force that the governor created on wildfire resilience, specifically championing cultural fire that Indigenous people have been practicing in California for thousands of years. Don, I'm excited to welcome you into this conversation on cutting the green tape and interested in on how you and your work intersects into this topic here.
Great. Thanks, Wade, for having me on, and I'm really happy to be able to share some input here from some of the work that I've been doing in this space. I guess first and foremost, I always think about myself doing applied work, thinking about the stewardship work, thinking about ways of addressing things in a very solutions-oriented manner. A little background also I'll just share is that I have worked as a regulator, working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in my early career, so I know some of the barriers that have existed, at least on the federal side in this, and know that there's a lot of parallels on the state side. One of the things I'll come back to is thinking about how Kellex mentioned and referencing you, Wade, in the idea of like being able to keep up with the rate of change. In my observations of being a steward in the land and in the space that we were working in around, say, 30 by 30 and the work that we do within the task force, there's a lot of change that's happening in our landscape that is being accelerated by the fires that we're experiencing and those sorts of things. And so I guess what I'd like to kind of start out with in this is really understanding that one, there's an urgency of action that we need to do, and that cutting the green tape is really taken an approach that I think is really important for us to be able to try to keep up with that rate of change. But I think that there's more that we can be doing, and I think Chuck in his comments also mentioned that as well, is like thinking about how we can do differently and the types of things that we can be doing. So I'm going to start off with that and framing this in the context of like Indigenous stewardship. When we think about Indigenous stewardship practices, as Wade noted, Indigenous fire being one, these practices have been around for many millennia, and they are, as we like to think about the language du jour, nature-based solutions. So fire, slowing water, spreading water, enhancing biodiversity are really fundamental aspects of Indigenous stewardship, and these are practices that predate, the existence of the state of California. In my mind, the way I look at this is these are keystone processes. These processes were not recognized when the state and federal laws were developed. So when we have, our very fantastic environmental policies, such as, the California Environmental Quality Act and the Endangered Species Act, they didn't take into account that these types of stewardship were kind of baseline processes. So I think about this and how California has been a leader in developing innovative policies, but at our federal levels, we haven't necessarily seen these kind of changes that have been able to keep up with that. And so the question I guess I pose is like, how do we actuate with our federal partners to then also improve our own systems? Over the last year or so, I've been able to work in some of this federal policy space, working with others to kind of identify opportunities at the federal level that kind of springboard off of the idea of cutting the green tape in the space of fire. Recently, we published a paper in the journal Fire Ecology. I think Geeta is going to share a link to this in the chat. But it's a paper that focuses on how we can basically achieve regulatory reform around key environmental policies at the federal level that I think also then would reinform how we think about cutting the green tape here in the state. Specifically, the paper addresses regulatory reform around the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, and the Clean Air Act. And basically how I look at it is that, there's an opportunity there for us to think about where this fits into cutting the green tape. So, if we think about the wildfire challenges, which is really the focus of this particular paper that I'm referencing, it's really, recognizing that we need to be thinking about fire as a baseline process, and these like nature-based solutions types of things are really a baseline process within the systems that we're dealing with, and that they really shouldn't be treated as actions or agency actions or human actions in that review process. If I relate that specifically to like Indigenous fire stewardship or cultural burning, as a lot of people refer to it, it's distinct from other types of burning. It's linked to understanding the ecology of systems and species and things like that are ultimately connected, and it's ultimately rooted in an Indigenous right to be able to steward. So as such, one of the recommendations from the paper at the federal level is to really think about how agencies shouldn't be regulating Indigenous fire stewardship and also, respecting tribal sovereignty. And then it also thinks about, the opportunities around co-stewardship and, that work with tribal stewardship not being a regulatory type of an action. On the NEPA side of it, the National Environmental Policy Act side of it, what it specifically looks at is recognizing that beneficial fire, using the term that we use here in California within the beneficial fire strategic plan. There's some basic things that we could basically look at there, and that is one, the restoring fire-dependent ecosystems with fire-adapted landscapes. Again, is not an agency action. And so we need to be thinking about how to address that. And that ultimately, by not taking action, we're actually making a decision that is an action. And that's an act to basically suppress fire, right? So those are really important points, I think, that are clear for us to consider. Under the Endangered Species Act and at the federal level, we think about the terms of how it's about the ecosystems upon which species depend. And a lot of these species, from a cultural knowledge standpoint, have evolved in landscapes with fire maintaining their habitat conditions. And so, one of the ideas there is to actually reframe the Endangered Species Act to acknowledge that fire is part of the natural and healthy ecosystems, and that in order to facilitate that process within the landscape, we need to be making pathways for things like cultural fire and those sorts of things to occur. General takeaway I would say is that we need to identify stewardship and maintenance as kind of the main things that we should be exempting. Particularly thinking about traditional cultural practices. I mentioned these are nature-based solutions that we're often talking about. And so, if they're practices that have helped to make California what it was when it was still under Indigenous stewardship, then we really need to be thinking about what those processes are and not regulating them. And then thinking about the opportunities for how to shift what challenges there are around the basic triggers of our environmental review processes, like funding and authorization of activities. So I think they're really key things. Why it matters, I would say, in the context of our major state initiatives, we think about accelerating the goals of like 30 by 30 and the strategic plan for beneficial fire. These are ways of aligning the things that I've talked about, this federal paper that we were just referencing, to try to address and accelerate this, because I think we're still behind the curve in terms of being able to get ahead of the changes that we're seeing in our landscapes. And I'll just kind of wrap it up by noting some things in the landscape that I'm coming from today up in Butte County, and that is that we've got a situation where probably 40% of the landscape in Butte County has burned in recent years between the Camp Fire, the Dixie Fire, North Complex Fire, and more recently the Park Fire. And we're trying to do post-fire recovery, but also do stewardship in the places that are still in the green, so to speak. And the challenges there obviously are coming down to the environmental review processes that are potentially there. And so doing things like slowing water down to capture sediment. We've just gone through the process of review and installing this on our Big Chico Creek Reserve, for campus at Chico State. My understanding is that the recent atmospheric river, we were able to capture with these water slowing devices that were installed under permits, over 70,000 cubic feet of sediment behind these structures. About 6,000 structures were installed. But again, this is like a nature-based solution. And how do we accelerate this within the landscape to get ahead of this as disasters occur and before those disasters even happen? So I'll wrap it up there, Wade. Thanks.
That is exciting. And, I didn't even realize that you were focused on this work of how do we help Indigenous stewardship, which we're working to expand and support tribes to expand across the state. How do we help that happen more quickly and more broadly? To your point, we have an urgent risk and catastrophic wildfire risks and all these other climate impacts. How do we get these practices on the ground more quickly, more affordably, more broadly? So I'm so glad you're driving that forward, and great to hear about the work actually to slow and spread the water in Butte County. We could have a whole nother discussion about the reintroduction of beavers in parts of the state, which Chuck Bonham, who we've heard from, is helping to lead, another nature-based solution. So all of these dots are connected. I want to connect another set of dots by introducing April Zahn from Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited, or what we know as DU, is one of the country's oldest conservation organizations. And it's actually hunters and anglers historically who were really driving efforts to conserve our landscapes and our fish and wildlife, and actually helped fund for over a century much of the conservation work that takes place. So April, big thanks for all that DU does. And I understand you're doing really interesting multi-benefit projects that may benefit from cutting the green tape. So interested in your perspective here.
Yeah, thanks for including us in the conversation, Secretary. I thought I'd just start out with a little bit of more context on what Ducks Unlimited is and what we do. So we are a nonprofit organization that works across the country to restore wetlands for waterfowl, migratory birds, and native fish and wildlife. And so we've worked for over 30 years in California, where we advance restoration projects both in coastal estuaries, freshwater streams and wetlands, and actually in agricultural lands where our projects benefit both farmers and wildlife. We work on a variety of projects, including projects that remove invasive plants, provide fish passage within streams, and reconnect historic tidal marsh to estuaries. Our projects also often include infrastructure improvements, such as construction of levees to provide flood protection to communities, for example, located near a restoration site, or constructions of trails and boat docks to provide public recreational opportunities. So that's those multi-benefit projects. As you mentioned, my specific job at Ducks Unlimited is to work with this small and mighty team to develop permitting strategies for Ducks Unlimited affiliated projects in our region. And so my team has been particularly interested in testing out the cutting green tape tools since we are typically in some phase of design or permitting for upwards of 50 projects a year, many of which are located on public lands and funded with public dollars. And so with limited staff capacity, identifying the most efficient permit pathway for our projects is really important. So with all that in mind, in the past 2 years, our team has been able to use all of the cutting green tape tools that we've kind of mentioned over these past panelist discussions. We've used them multiple times, and we've used them to successfully permit about 10 different restoration projects throughout the state. Those projects have ranged in size from 50 acres to 13,000 acres benefited by the work, and they've restored a range of habitat types. I would attribute our success in using these tools to early and frequent coordination with agency permitting staff, and importantly, the relationships we've built by engaging those staff as partners in our projects. I'm really proud of that, and that investment has allowed us to focus on collective desired outcomes, which are more restoration more quickly and at lower cost to the public, rather than exclusively on the how of the process. And while the tools clearly aren't perfect, with a bit of practice, we found them to be restoration focused, consistent, and predictable. They provide clear guidance to consider when you design projects, and they provide common language for envisioning an efficient and transparent permitting process, oftentimes across agencies. And to kind of reiterate some of what other speakers have said is, importantly, they do not provide a pass for projects to avoid regulatory oversight. The tools we've used have been quite robust, but fair, and importantly, straightforward after you get familiar with them. And then probably most importantly from my perspective is that these tools have provided the opportunity for restoration practitioners such as myself and agency permitting staff to collaborate on how to move a project forward as efficiently as possible. The state's leadership on this initiative has made space for agency staff to lead with cutting green tape solutions in those bold and novel ways that Phil talked about, which has created a culture of collaboration, ownership, and creativity. And our collective teams are showing up with their solution-oriented hats on, they're honest, and they're really focused on delivering better, more thoughtful projects more quickly. And maybe
Incredible.
just to close, I would say I'd quote Phil, who earlier this week said, in a time of needing to do more with less and to do it faster and better, these are the types of tools that we need to advance these projects.
So good to hear, April, that you guys have been able to avail yourself of these cutting green tape tools, and it's actually making a difference. And remarkable, projects from 50 acres to 13,000 acres of benefit. So excited. And I'm hoping that you can continue to suggest how we move further and faster. One of the things I want to ask those who are joining us today is to use that Q&A button if there are other specific suggestions that you have for us to continue to improve the process. Please let us know. Again, we're going to capture all of this and use it as input to us. Batting cleanup in this conversation is Erica Lovejoy. Erica works for conservation, sustainable conservation. SUSCON, as we know it, is a remarkable non-governmental organization that partners with land stewards, including public agencies and farmers and all manner of those taking care of the lands to advance conservation. And Erica, you and SUSCON really, in many ways, helped drive this movement and catalyze people like me to take this so seriously. You all have been working on this cutting green tape effort for a very long time. And as I understand it, a lot of what we put in place were recommendations that SUSCON made, and you continue to drive forward. And you have a recent report and set of recommendations around what else we can be doing. So if you would talk about, where we've come from, but importantly, where we have to go.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Secretary. I really appreciate being here. We've heard from the other speakers. There's definitely been a lot of momentum and progress, and which is great to see, but we know that there's more work to do. And our team at Sustainable Conservation has definitely been listening and learning from the restoration practitioners and agency staff out there to figure out what's next. And the recent interviews that we did for the white paper, it's about 40 organizations. We got a lot of insight on what's working well and where more progress is needed. And so my wish list, based on those interviews, really falls into 4 key buckets. So the first bucket is around those restoration specific teams at the agencies. You heard folks speak to that a bit. We heard tremendous support for the dedicated restoration teams at California Department of Fish and Wildlife, their cutting green tape team, and then on the federal side with the NOAA Restoration Center. So they use these teams are special because they proactively use efficient permitting. They develop the efficient permitting tools just for restoration, and they reduce costs and have more time for technical assistance, and projects get to implementation sooner. So across the board, we heard that folks have a strong desire to see more of these restoration specific teams at all of the state and federal agencies. The next big bucket is about training. I heard Phil talk about that. Glad to hear about all the training. It's about training and then leadership support for the use of efficient permitting tools. So like Phil said, creating those efficient permitting tools, super important first step, but it's a new process that everybody has to learn. And so we heard loud and clear from both staff and applicants that they want more ongoing permanent training to be able to use these tools more effectively. And then along with that request, we also heard a call for agency leadership to further empower staff to really fully take advantage of these new regulatory approaches. Change is hard. It takes time to institutionalize these things. And they also want to see really clear guidance on the frequent policy questions that often come up that can slow things down. And seeing guidance direction very similar to what you did, Secretary Crowfoot, with the initiation of the Cutting Green Tape initiative. The next bucket is scaling up the permitting tools that are working well and then filling in the regulatory gaps. And we learned from our interviews that 75% of the project implementers that we talked to, they really rely on these restoration specific regulatory pathways that have been developed. It's essential to get their projects moving forward. And they want to see these tools that are working well scaled up. For example, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Habitat Restoration Enhancement Act and the companion permit at the State Water Board, that was brought up a lot. People want to see those expanded. And then for those agencies that don't have any efficient permitting mechanisms in place, folks want to see them developed so everybody can move along at a similar pace. Now, the last big bucket I want to mention is around addressing some of the long-standing sticky issues that often come up with restoration. So folks brought up things like reducing the mitigation burden for voluntary habitat restoration projects. What are the creative ways we can deal with that? Because sometimes it stops projects from happening. Then also, efficiently permitting mitigation that is indeed needed for infrastructure, energy projects, public services, so those restoration projects can get done in a timely and strategic way, and we can get the most ecological benefit out of them. And one last thing, last but not least, that is definitely on the wish list and was brought up in almost every interview we had, and that is making restoration programs less reliant on fees and then finding the long-term funding for those restoration agency staff and programs. And I know that's a tough one. The budget's been difficult. We all know that. But especially after the passage of Prop 4, all the project funding coming from that, and then with the existing federal funding, we see agency staffing as a really important investment so we can ensure that we get the habitat restoration and climate resilience projects accomplished. So that's my wish list. I'm optimistic we can make it happen.
Well, Erica, huge thanks for all the work. I know you've really guided this white paper and this effort for the last several years. And for those who are joining, you can look on the chat and find out more information. We'll actually connect to the white paper and all of the recommendations. And Erica, I think it's a great roadmap for us to consider what else we need to be doing. I want to bring everybody back on the screen here just for the last 5 minutes. I hope that we provided those who have tuned in, whether they're living this Cutting the Green Tape effort or this is the first time they've heard about it, we've given people a sense of the real progress that's underway. Erica, I'm glad you mentioned mitigation because we are building so much important infrastructure across the state, whether it's renewable energy to meet our 100% clean energy target, or whether it's water resilience projects to protect ourselves from drought and flooding. And a lot of those projects need environmental mitigation. And so enabling that mitigation to be really good, high quality mitigation and to happen relatively efficiently is really important. I just want to ask, I don't know if it's Chuck or Kellex, people that are either, well, maybe I'll pick on you, Chuck. To what extent can these tools be used for mitigation? And is that an area of further exploration?
It's definitely an area of exploration. And there are many different views about it. But the reality is if we can fit that work to important criteria about environmental benefit, that's where the frontier is, and we're working through some of our first test cases.
That's really helpful. And Kellex, it sounds like you may have used Cutting Green Tape tools for some projects that are actually mitigation.
Yeah, we certainly have. There are some projects that we've done that are maybe wetlands restoration or that sort of thing that we're mitigating for impacts from public infrastructure, essential projects. And so it had mitigation funds involved, but we used a number of these permitting tools to efficiently advance the solutions. The impact already happened, and we want to make sure that we get the mitigation done as quickly as possible after the impact already happened.
That's really important, yeah. Megan, I want to give you the final word of this very great conversation because this dialogue is not done, and you can advertise some deeper dives on these topics here in coming weeks.
Great. Thanks for that, Secretary. And thank you to everybody that presented here today. What a breadth of information and just inspiration. And what I'm hoping is that this really has everyone excited out there to learn more about what tools and techniques are there, because this is the kickoff of a Lunch and Learn series that will be starting in January. That's going to have 3 or more sessions that will really provide training and digging deeper on understanding what permitting efficiencies are out there, talking about permitting at scale, and really staying up to date on some of the new things that are coming online. So would encourage you to go to our 30 by 30 website and sign up for our newsletter. It's a great way to find out when these are happening. And I believe our colleague Gita will put that information in the chat.
Excellent. We've got just a couple of minutes. Any final words from our panelists? Chuck.
We need all y'all, and y'all need us. Together, we can do this better. And it's just super rewarding work for our department staff who get this assignment to be literally day in and day out thinking about the projects that help save nature and getting them done.
I guess I'll take the final word to extend that thanks to everybody who's joined. As Chuck mentioned, we've had over 450 people join. I bet you a lot of you are on the front lines doing this work across California. So huge thanks, whether you're part of a conservation organization, whether you're a part of a resource conservation district or a land trust, whether you're an employee of one of our incredible state agencies or a federal partner or a tribal leader. It really does take all of us, and we are in a race against time. Climate change and other stressors are impacting our natural environment and which is, of course, our home. And so as Chuck pointed out, the quicker and more effectively we can do this work on environmental restoration, the better off our landscapes will be and the better off we will be. So with that, I thank you and just share that if you have any follow-up questions or suggestions for us, you can hit us up with an email at secretarysuggestions@resources.ca.gov. Thanks again, and go forth and cut more green tape. Take care.